Welcome to the third lecture of the Architekturtheorie Welt seminar entitled Of Clouds, Rainbows and Storms, Thinking Meteorologically in the Information Age. In today's lecture, which is entitled Of Deviations and Turbulences, Communicating Through Silent Transformations, we will engage in an exercise of reversal. That is, we will embrace the meteora not as manifestations of chaos, as what is generally done, therefore not in our humanly centered perspective as potential threats to our existences or to the order of our world, but rather precisely as the inverse, that is, as visible models of existence itself, as the French philosopher Michel Serres puts it, and that need to be understood, therefore, against the backdrop of the universal law of death, in other words, of entropy. Following Michel Serres, following the French philosophers' reading of Lucretius, as much as our own reading, with which we've been engaging in the course of the seminar, and precisely the reading of the sixth book of Lucretius' De Rerum Natura, we will engage with the meteora from the perspective of chance, of fluidity and mutability with regard to information. And embarking in the meteora and thinking meteorologically, as we will see, implies to account for life in terms of deviation from general statics and general equilibrium. And these two terms already invite us to proceed further in our interrogations and take up seriously the question that Vera Bühlmann asks in her own book about Michel Serres, Mathematics and Information in the Philosophy of Michel Serres, and the question being, and I quote, "Is there a way to think of architecture in the meteora?" In other words, it invites us to reflect further on meteorological thinking by considering it beyond an architectonical thought in direct relation to architecture, and in order to invent manners, to establish stabilities, and to build in our current age, that is an age of information and the age of the Anthropocene. Lucretius' treatise, De Rerum Natura, is a node to, as much as an exposition of, the Epicurean doctrine of atomism. The world depicted by Lucretius is one of abundance, and he depicts it in poetic terms, and if we follow Michel Serres, also in physical and mathematical ones. This world of abundance is characterized by the wealth of life, which spurs from the elements of all kinds that the earth contains, according to Lucretius, and from the multiplicitous combinations into which these elements enter. As the poet writes, evidently, the reason why all these things grow from the ground is that the earth contains countless seeds of countless things, mingled in countless ways, and sorts them out before distributing them. This countlessness inscribes at the very heart of life itself and of the doctrine, therefore, a view of the world that cannot be reduced to a general or unified system. Rather, in the workings of Lucretius, cosmogony and cosmology, those workings are beneath and beyond the threshold of our perception, as much as within the spectrum of it. Life is indeed intertwined with the infinitesimal level, that is, the atomic scales at which things stem from aggregative processes, and with the infathomableness of all that is. It deals with the great numbers. Only by taking, as Lucretius writes, a deep and wide view in every direction, and by thinking rationally about the immeasurability of the world and of phenomena, can one inhabit the earth, liberated from, and I quote, the weight of superstition. This doctrine, Michel Serres writes, is an ancient doctrine, but also a contemporary discovery. Indeed, for centuries, it had been considered, Lucretius' doctrine, not only as having lost its currency, but even more so as being a weak doctrine, which was considered to be full of absurdities, be they geometrical, mechanical, or physical. Because it prevents the endless chain of causation, the world depicted by Lucretius indeed negates the determinism upon which classical science, materialism, and modern Occidental thought in general have erected themselves. And Michel Serres writes that no one reads the Meteora, not those of Lucretius or Descartes, nor of anyone. Why this repression? Because philosophers, historians, the masters of science, are concerned only with the ancient idea of law, with exact determination or rigorous over-determination, and with the god of Laplace, with absolute control, and thus with mastery without vacillation, or the ambiguity of margins, with power and order. The Meteora, as the epitome of Lucretius' fluctuant world, to which the author dedicates an entire book, the sixth one, indeed endanger the firmness of modern Occidental scientific rationality and the universal character that warranties the legitimacy of natural laws. With their workings in terms of great number and local accumulation and dispersions, the Meteora radically weaken such knowledge, ruled by determination and absolute control, and the world pictures it sustains. They rather depict a world ruled by chance, formlessness, and transformation. They threaten history inasmuch as history is understood as a linear chronological unfolding of time, by introducing the irreversibility of thermodynamics. Against this intellectual promise or threat, Michel Serres writes that not only the atomist doctrine had to be reduced to the domain of psychology and free will and subjectivity, but the Meteora in general had to be minored and left to practical men, for they resisted the abstraction and controlled protocols developed in the closed subsystems of modern science. And the French sociologist and philosopher Bruno Latour writes that it is part of our worldview that things are ordered, that order is the rule, and that disorder should be eliminated wherever possible. Disorder always has to be eliminated from politics and ethics, as well as from science. The French philosopher and anthropologist Bruno Latour, as I was saying, highlights how several philosophers, including Michel Serres, have challenged such assumptions of order and elimination of disorder, and have challenged such assumptions that have been at the very heart of the modern scientific paradigm by means of this process of intellectual inversion. Nurtured by the recourse to the ancient theory of atomism as much as to information theory, these philosophers propose that disorder be considered the rule and order the exception, and also that only from disorder can an orderly pattern emerge. This inversion consists of this reversal of perspective, in Serres' own words. So, if we abide by this reversal, we have to understand that in order to make sense, Lucretius' original fall of atoms needs to not be considered in the terms within which classical science operates, that is, in the global framework of solid mechanics, within which fluids are but particular cases. Rather, Michel Serres warns us, to understand Lucretius in a manner that matters, it is solids that need to be considered and to become specific cases in a fluid world. Modern science, if one adopts this perspective, and if one engages in this exercise of reversal of the perspective, well, modern science could thereof be revitalized by reclaiming other sources, by convening the works of those who have concerned themselves with fluids more than with solids, in the first place of which Vitruvius, of which Michel Serres reminds us that the author dedicated a full book of his treatise to hydraulics, but also with Leonardo's works and drawings and texts and thinking, who actually dedicated several of these to the diluvio, the deluge, where he retranscribes in the form of ekphrasis the generative swirling of the waters, capturing them at once phonetically, as Lucretius also did, but also morphologically. Life appears pulsating to the rhythm of fluid dynamics, characterized by the incessant variation of turbulences. More generally, this inversion also requires a stepping out. Serre indeed invites us to exit the closed systems of modern science, of modern rationality, in order to get out in the weather, to get out in the meteora, to get out in the turbulent world of Lucretius, and in the open systems of the meteora, as I was saying, and of nature at large. And again, here nature is understood in the Greek sense of the world as being at once physical and metaphysical. To be thrown in this outside requires us not so much to learn to live differently, to walk or to breathe differently than what we already do. It rather requires us to construct another form and status of knowledge, maybe one that is more adequate to our daily experience of the world, that would allow us to attain to this milieu between the earth and the sky, to the milieu of the meteora precisely, to this probabilistic domain of mixtures in which our lives are fully embedded universally. Lucretius' world is a world of fluxes, it's a fluid world. At the center of it, as Michel Serre names it, is the principle of the cataract, the infinite downward fall of atoms through the void by their property of weight, that the philosopher proposes to think of theoretically. So Michel Serre invites us to think of the cataract theoretically as the flow of a liquid. In the atomist conception, nothing is of an invincible solidity except for the atoms themselves, the original components. Not even the things that these atoms form by aggregation are immutably solid. The compound bodies are more or less resistant, they are more or less porous, products of the permanent processes of aggregation and flowing away of the atomic particles. As Lucretius writes, so true is that from all objects emanations flow away and are discharged in all directions on every side. These effluences stream away without any delay or interruption. In considering these compound bodies, one should therefore not ask what they are, seeking for their ontological nature, but rather account for them transversally, capturing them as temporarily stable degrees of resistance within perpetual streams. Hence, Lucretius writes, the density of the clouds are neither, and I quote, as dense as that of stones or wood, nor yet as thin as that of mist or smoke, always. The meteora is the exemplary domain of such fluid composition for Lucretius. It is a domain that is not particularly loosely tangled, that is not globally solid. It is rather a place of local accumulations, condensation and expulsion, concentration and dispersion, under the combined effects of the wind, of the sun and the water, and all phenomena that the text transcribes in its own materiality. But one may ask if following Lucretius implies that one needs to abide by the principle of the cataract to imagine life really stems from the laminar fall of atoms in the void. When reverting to atomism, Michel Serre does not propose to come around to this idea in a literal manner, not at all. Rather, in his view, the cataract is to be regarded as ideal and, in effect, theoretical. It operates as a mechanical abstraction, levered to understand what the reversal of perspective the atomist doctrine proposes and potentially allows to operate, and what such reversal entails. That is, that life can be accounted for in terms of flows, and the entropic dissolution of the passing of time, but also in terms of chance and the local negentropic reversal of such ruinous model. The cataract, for Michel Serres, is indeed an abstraction, it's a mechanical abstraction, and it is also a physical one. It allows to think of atomism in theoretical terms and to model the meteora on two different ideals, as one can see in the diagram here. The cataract, on the one hand, the laminar flow of atoms, levers a mechanical abstraction, while atomization is accountable in physical terms. The atoms fall in laminar fluxes only ideally, as Serres notes, implying the following interrogation. What are the conditions under which it, the cataract, enters into concrete experience, that of vortical flow? And so to be embedded in the meteora, to exit in the open, is actually to move from abstraction to concrete experience. It means entering into nature, into life, stepping out of the laboratory and its determinist views, to learn from and develop a form of knowledge adequate to a milieu which is rhythmed by chance and by the uncontrollable. The cataract is the exit path towards real phenomena, in Michel Serres' view, towards this outside of the meteora. This is what the abstraction of the cataract opens for us. It opens and teaches us that flows are there, that they're everywhere and always. They are conditions of possibility for experience that are not superimposed, but are rather in the world as a datum, as things given. Time flows, it passes, rivers flow, always downstream, winds blow. Not all things flow according to the same rhythm. They are alternative, more or less potent, more or less fast, headed in multiple directions too. Yet, in flowing and in blowing, they all erode something, be it rocks, stocks, architectures, or, in the case of the plague, as Lucretius writes, life. The invariance in Lucretius' text, the cataract, the flow, the full of atoms, is what inevitably brings to erosion and to collapse. It is the universal law that operates throughout the text, what Michel Serres calls, and I quote, the universal law of death. The fluxes tend towards the ultimate equilibrium, and it is at once at the core of being and the promise of its inevitable end. In the cataract, the atoms fall in parallel, they do not touch, never. The flow is constant, it's infinite, and nothing happens, but continuous passing of atoms without encounter. In this system, there is only uniformity, only destiny, only an infinite sequence of reasons and causes. The atoms have a weight, therefore they fall. Abstractly, Serres invites us to question the nature of the laws that philosophy and the scientific tradition have for the most part attributed to nature. Laws that are considered universal, for they are inflexible and determined. And Serres writes, there is nothing to know, to discover, to invent in all this repetition. In fact, it falls in the parallel of identity. Nothing new under the reign of the same. This is the zero state of information, redundancy. The chain of causation, the fall of atoms, and the indefinite repetition of letters, three figures necessary for the 0 point of science. In such a view, the infinite cataract therefore becomes the model of identity, of the repetition of the same. That is, of a thought that cannot account for invention, for novelty, for creation, for the appearance of life, but that rather produces an image of the world that is in order, that is immutable, that is stable, and that, most importantly, is identical to itself, is self-similar through time. In such a view, The laws of nature spell out what things already are, and how they should always remain. The same cause will produce the same effects, inevitably. Life does not simply pass, but it reiterates and becomes redundant. The same information is repeated, recopied. It's therefore producing more of the same, that is, too much of it, and therefore nothing new. Should the cataract be concrete, the same would only produce the same. Information would be null. Nothing could exist that is not already existing. Nothing could potentially be erected and made to stand. The same is non-being, Serre writes, and in the incessant flow of the cataract, there is a rush towards that state, towards redundancy in informational terms, and towards maximum entropy in energetic thermodynamic ones. The second law of thermodynamics, as proposed by Clausius in 1850 as a generalization of Carnot's principle, states that within an energetically isolated enclosure, there is a spontaneous, progressive, and irreversible evening out of temperatures. The leveling out of all differences in thermal potential leads to the disappearance of macroscopic phenomenon and to the definitive inertia of the system. In other words, the invariance of the total amount of energy, which is stated by the first law, goes with an inevitable degradation of it, the extent to which is measured in terms of entropy. From this perspective, the entropy is a term to measure the dissipation of heat by means of encrypting a large amount, as Vera Billman writes, large enough to count the totality of possible transformation in an ideal state in which every next step is equally likely, entropy. Its second principle, that the law of Carnot, establishes that for every work performed, there is a degradation of such energy, that is, a rise of entropy, a rise in entropy. And entropy, therefore, is a magnitude. It measures the non-availability of energy and or the quantity of thermal energy that cannot be transformed into effective work. Consequently, according to the second law, every phenomenon, whatever it may be, is necessarily accompanied by an increase of entropy within the system where it occurs, writes and summarizes Jacques Monod in his book Chance and Necessity. The plague on which Lucretius finishes the book on the Meteora, the sixth book finishes with a last section dedicated to the plague of Athens, is nothing else but this pure entropic phenomena of circulation that leads to death. It tends towards uniformity by means of virality, imitation, and repetition of the same at very high frequencies. The virus reigns from circulating without obstacles and gains its power in a purely cumulative manner, piling up cadavers. Yet, this repetition is the very mechanism through which the dominant virus will eventually extinguish, having used up all the space of potential circulation, inevitably slowed down by the uniformity of the system within which it spreads and which it has participated in producing, before becoming properly immobile. If Lucretius atoms do not collide, they do not touch, then there is nothing new under the sun of sameness, writes Michel Serre. If cultures do not meet, they do not touch, then there is no exchange, there is no migration, no lively principle of culture. And if the law is universal, if the atoms cannot know any exception, then there is nothing, Serre writes again. If nothing moves in the same sense, then there is no sense. No story, no history, no projects, no politics, no poetics. This state of maximum entropy can be understood in terms of uniformity, of the sterile repetition and return of the same, the total expansion of and conformity to one form only. Uniformity here can be understood as the concept of production not as a concept of production, sorry, not of reason, that actually emerges at the end of a process and can be expanded to a reading of our contemporary lives, I believe, as the impoverished double of the concept of universal. The uniform thus emanates from a commodification in the general economy of globalization. And Vera Bühlmann writes that in its most general form, economy keeps things in circulation at the cost of dissolving the historical integrity of specific facts, events, structures, and culture. An economy is indeed a machine producing entropy, she writes. Indeed, the more general the order of the economy, that processualizes decisions without an orientation, be it political, historic, the more entropic its effects. Something then, something must allow escaping from the uniform, escaping from the monotone. Something must make sense, or give sense, give one. It must be a declination, a minimal condition of displacement that would allow atoms to collide and pure circulation and self-similarity to actually be interrupted. And this, we understand, cannot be inscribed in any universal law that would determine the time and place of such appearance, of the appearance of such deviation. It needs to happen in, as Lucretius writes, in incerto tempore, incertisque locis, in uncertain time and place, outside of the well-defined closed walls of the laboratory and of the closed systems of classical physics. To think something else than the reversible entropic process, to account for the fact that there is something rather than nothing, science needs to tell of nature in its transformative diversity. It needs to tell of the exception of, the universal law of the flow to the appearance of information as a riddle or a certain squall upon the great sea of redundancy. That can only happen improbably. So going back to Serre's insistent question, we must recognize that in the open, streaming does not remain laminar. In practice, Michel Serre writes, physically speaking, a flow always is or becomes turbulent. The univocality of the first mechanical model, the cataract, corresponds to the heterogeneity of the second model, the cloud, in which all atoms circulate stochastically. The general precipitations of the first equates to the multiple local precipitations of the second. From the uniformity of the flow comes the local angular deviation. And from the stochastic disorder of the clouds come rain, thunder, storms, snow, and according to Lucretius, even eruptions and earthquakes. The passage from the uniform to the transformative, from the monotone to the variegated, from noise to signal, implies mobilizing a more complex knowledge, one that can account for the intricacy of order and disorder, equilibrium and deviations. In the Meteora, one is fully determined by the conditions of experience and observation. Just as the view is obstructed, information can only be partial and knowledge can only be localized. In the Meteora, one is immersed in and not dominating over the situation globally. Something deviates, Lucretius writes. When the atoms are being drawn downward through the void by the property of weight, at absolutely unpredictable times and places, they deflect slightly from their straight course to a degree that could be described as no more than a shift of movement. If they were not apt to swerve, all would fall downward through the infamable void like drops of rain. No collisions between primary elements would occur, and no blows would be affected, with the result that nature would never have created anything. The swerve is not that drastic though. It is not a break, it is not a rip, but it's a subtle deflation. It's a fluxion. The atoms swerve, but only slightly, Lucretius writes, Lucretius insists on that point, but only to an infinitesimal degree, he writes. The clinamen does not break with the fall. It does not introduce the tabula rasa of a clear difference. Rather, it introduces a swerve, meaning the atom carries with it some of what it has swerved from. There are no drastically oblique movements, for the atoms that fall under their own weight could not certainly change direction, at least not perceptibly. The deviation of atoms and the alteration in their movement needs to be as small as possible in order to respect the very principles that Lucretius had previously established. It needs to happen nec plusquam minimum, no more than the minimum. Such a slight deviation implies to think at infinitesimal scales, which can only be grasped differentially through differential calculus. The elementary components of Lucretius' physics is therefore not the atom, that is an entity, but the declination that introduces a change in the general movement, which describes a minimal angle and makes the model constructible, therefore, in physical, mathematical, and geometrical terms. It introduces an indivisible angularity in 3 dimensions in the constant flux of life, and therefore in the meteora. Its infinitesimal nature implies it remains as close as possible to the common root of the ordinary law. It deviates from universality, yes, but only minimally so. The clinamen is therefore the infinitesimal operator of transformation, that is, of life in general, as Michel Serres notes, and I quote, or, quite precisely, the smallest turbulence. In the light of the constructible models and the phenomena experienced during the meteora, things become clear. An instant and a minimum deviation are enough. An instant later, turbulence forms a pocket in the 3-dimensional flow, a local pocket where the flows adrift to go back upon themselves. In this place of singularity, these flows change their direction, their force, their volume. In thermodynamic, the clinamen is that which frees the world from the irreversibility of entropic time. It allows for a change in the course of things, in the flow of redundancy. It produces turbulences in the laminar flow, small riddles in the sea, sudden lightning. By analogy, negative entropy makes information appear, stochastically in uncertain time and place, locally and temporarily, and makes things hold, even if for a moment. In such a perspective, the meteora appears as the domain of constant flow, yes, of stochastic chaos, and of continuously appearing turbulences. The sky, indeed, is never uniform. And Michel Serres writes again, and I quote, that there are flows but fluctuations, there are floods but turbulence. The book on the meteora is the book of turbulences, he writes when referring to Lucretius. The turbulence, therefore, is not the exception, but that which produces, which forms and transforms, and therefore explains the movements, the coming into beings of the meteora and in the meteora. The atmosphere, the entropic domain of fluxes and flows, is full of negentropic pockets, of phenomena that deviate slightly from the universal law, and that, locally and stochastically, evade the irreversibility of entropic time, that flows and never comes back, according to Léon Briouillat. In Lucretius' text, the local turbulences make things appear, they make things dance a different dance, they make clouds erupt into rain and expose their fire seeds in the form of lightning. The local turbulence disturbs the universal course of the fall of atoms. It disturbs from the term disturbare, to throw into disorder, from turba, turmoil, that also points to the cloud, this term disturbare. It points to a crowd, it points to the big number, that which can only be dealt with statistically and probabilistically. The clinamen initiates turbulences, sometimes proper vortexes from verdere, to turn, the primitive form of the constructions of things and of nature in general. There would be no word if not, no world and no word really, if not for the clinamen. There would be no invention if not for the chancy contingent deviation and its functional figures of constitution and formation, these turbulences and the vortexes. Serre writes, it then becomes the global figure of transformation in general, as the clinamen was its minimal or local operator. Things, and so nature, are formed by atomic conjunction in and through this very vortex. But what is more, they exist and continue in and through it. Finally, they destroy themselves, come apart, as if it were dwindling to nothing. Time is the fluctuation of turbulences, which make time, maintain it in their implications, set it going, and finally allow it to disappear. So from this, I would like to draw two implications. The first has to do with chance as the sole source of any creation. The second has to do with formation and the silent infinitesimal transformations as the only manner in which life passes. The first implication with chance implies to think once more of how the meteora allowed to exit the closed systems of classical science to enter the open set of nature, a sort of middle ground in Michel Serres' words, occupied entirely with the movement of bodies and the planets that situates itself between mechanics and astronomy. This milieu, as we have seen, is ruled over by very global laws. In Serres' words, it is the domain, and I quote, of aleatory and of great numbers, of a very complicated mixture of the reversible and the irreversible, and of non-closed systems. In statistical terms, the macrodomain of the meteora, this atmospheric milieu, corresponds to a probabilistic distribution of an ensemble of indiscernible microstates, in which the movement of molecules can only be measured and calculated in populations. The meteorological phenomena appears as turbulences in the universal flow, as negentropic pockets in the entropic, irreversible passing of time. And yet, they happen. And beyond the meteora, things hold for a few centuries, a few years maybe, a few days, or even a few hours. They divert from the flow and they stand and hold firm before decaying, disappearing, or dying. Why does this hold, Michel Serres asks? Simply because it does not hold completely. Every case will be a minimum degree of out of true, Serres writes. There has to be a minimally open solid angle. Yet it holds by a miracle. And by a miracle, I mean the case statistically of extreme rarity. Just as lightning, the clinamen happens by chance and is therefore scattered stochastically in space-time. Just as the clinamen, life is not paradoxical, only an exception to statistical law. Jacques Monod, the biologist, doesn't say differently, and I quote, "It necessarily follows that chance alone is at the source of every innovation, of all creation in the biosphere. Pure chance, absolutely free but blind, at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution. This central concept of modern biology is no longer one among other possible or even conceivable hypotheses. It is today the sole conceivable hypothesis, the only one that squares with the observed and tested fact. To raise the eye to the sky and smell the air is, in such a way, an anti-anthropocentric move. It implies accepting that chance is not only the sole operator of the weather, but also more generally and more intimately of all life, ours not differently from any other one. To accept that chance is the only motor of creation is indeed destructive from our classical understanding of human life as ordered and solely necessary. The difference between me and the other, be it human, animal, geological, or else, does not therefore proceed from a clear cut. Rather than abiding by the ontological quest of thinking what things are, and if they are at all, the sinologist François Julien rather invites us to approach it in terms of silent transformations. To give priority to the rhythm, I quote, bearer of regulation, to approach life through the breathing that renews it and follow the instructive manner in which spring becomes summer, without any separation between them being even slightly discernible. The global cyclical changing of the meteora nevertheless accommodates local deviations from the universal course in infinitesimal ways, minutes breaches that give way to transformations, or the ordering of forms silently through a process of modification continuation or communication, as François Julien notes, that comes, in his view, from the Chinese biantong, literally continuity through change. Biantong conjugates the events with the constant course of things and understands becoming simultaneously in the light of continuity, difference, and difference. On the one hand, biantong implies, as Julien writes, a modification, a bifurcation, an innovation, but also on the other, a continuation that carries with it, that conserves, that inherits. And this is the continuation that allows for communication to take place across modification, so to say, throughout transformation, silently. If we revert to our initial question posed by Vera Bühlmann, is there a way to think of architecture in the meteora? I would like to propose that architecture should be viewed as a manner to establish negentropic conditions of inhabitation within the entropic flow of existence, by means of the mastery, at once intellectual and technical, so to say, of mechanisms of stabilities and timekeeping in turbulent environments, that is, through bracing, code, and the manipulation of data, as we will continue to discuss in the course of the seminar. Thank you.